All right, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you all for coming, both those in the room and those on Zoom. Thanks to Lou for managing the Zoom connection, to Scott and Bill for the acoustics and recording here. That many people commented earlier today on the incredible timing of the Supreme Court decision being timed to introduce this great decisions topic this evening. That the decision was expected. That those who follow the Supreme Court and pay attention to the questions that the justices asked of both sides, as well as for those who know constitutional law a lot better than I do, that this was pretty close to a no-brainer, that the president's actions violated constitutional division of responsibility with the Congress. It is an important decision, but in my judgment, it's more important for U.S. domestic politics, constitutional law, division of responsibility and power than it is for international trade, for tariffs, for the relationship of the United States and our allies and partners. That most of the world will understand that President Trump has suffered a major defeat from the Supreme Court. They will immediately notice that
Oh, shit.
I hit the wrong button. You're so.
Oh, okay.
There you go. Okay, you're back.
Now we've got it right, I hope. That with respect to the imposition.
That was operator error up here. I apologize.
Okay.
You were talking about most of the countries recognize, and this was a more major decision domestically than internationally. I think that's where you left off.
Yes. Okay. I'll pick it up from there, because internationally, the disruptions to the global order generally, and the specific disruptions of tariffs and the way tariffs have been used in the last year is for a time alleviated but not solved by the Supreme Court decision. Part of it is the damage has been done, and it's going to take a lot more time and effort on the part of future administrations to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, if that's possible. But it's also a function of the system was broken, and I'll come back to that. I will defer discussion really to the Q&A section of the specifics of the Supreme Court decision as it applies to trade and tariffs, because I want to focus on the larger contextual issues, policy issues, which tariffs are a part. They're an instrument in a much larger approach to international relations, a much larger approach to trade, and do this for three reasons. One is, for those of you who've read the article in the Great Decisions Workbook, it will be reviewing some of what was said. More importantly, it's the totality of policies that the United States and our partners and allies, and we started it. The trading system was developed collectively, particularly after the 1960s. It ceased to be an American-only undertaking. And the third reason is understanding the logic that went into the now obsolescent, if not obsolete, rules-based trading order that the United States initiated in the late 1940s. I hope provides guidance for elements and approaches that need to be a part of whatever comes next, or the next stages in ameliorating the downsides of where we are. So let me begin with a point that I did make at last session, and that is that trade and trade controls, tariffs were a key pillar, but also a key instrument of a U.S. grand strategy after World War II that was intended to reduce the likelihood of a future major depression and reduce the danger of war, growing out of unbridled economic competition, competition for resources. It was different resources before World War II, oil, strategic metals and minerals. Now the slogan is rare earths in there. But the idea is you build a system that assures access to people who have money to buy them. That it's not a giveaway, but if you've got money, you can buy the resources. That other obstacles to purchase are minimized in it. That the other elements in this grand strategy that are examined, albeit briefly, in the Great Decision series this year are the role of alliances. And two of the future talks, the one on Ukraine and European security, and the one on deterioration of alliances and prospects for nuclear proliferation, get at that dimension. A different session that Steve Stedman will do looks at some of the multinational, international organizations, institutions that were intended to build stability into the system, to put a buffer around US power. So things that might have been done because Washington said, do it, we're big and we're powerful, is done through international institutions. I'll talk about that later. That this is normal international practice. So it's not the Americans said this is how you do it. This is the agreed upon set of rules, the norms of behavior. And the idea was that the institutions, inculcation of the norms, acceptance of the rules would provide a stabilizing mechanism that didn't require coercive action. Our president has decided he prefers coercive action. That is to go back to a different approach. The grand strategy also envisioned using trade and investment as a way to complement development aid to the now 140 additional countries that were former colonies or the breakup of former empires. And the recognition that these places were poor, these places were underdeveloped, these places had specialized development to meet the needs of the colonial power. And some of the international institutions, as well as US trade policies, were designed to accelerate modernization or development, to provide the basis for a middle class that would have a stake in the performance of government and provide a basis for democracy. All of these things were seen as interconnected and mutually reinforcing. A primary reason for the asymmetry in the way the U.S. imposed tariffs on others and did not demand reciprocity for them was this developmental goal. Use the strength of the American economy. We didn't need to protect American industry from competition from Peru or Malawi or someplace in there. So low tariffs to help them to develop industries and products we would sell. And if they had high products on the United States, they probably didn't have enough money to buy the higher end products that we had to sell anyway. The attention there was on European recovery, primarily European and later Japanese recovery. So there was a lot of thought that went into this approach. That at the time, this is late 1940s when this was hammered out, what the United States was putting together was a dramatic break with the past practice. Traditional practices, imperial practices, and every country that basically mattered was or had been an empire. France, UK, former Ottoman Empire, former Austrian Empire, Japanese Empire, Russian Empire, that operated with, among other things, a quest for autarky, to be as independent as possible, economically independent as possible, not being vulnerable to leverage or manipulation from other countries who could cut off access to certain materials or cut off access to markets for selling products. That this was the imperial model. It was also the explicit model of Joseph Stalin, and the Soviet became the Soviet bloc or the Warsaw Pact, that socialism in one country was the slogan, that each member country was to have a comprehensive economy to produce everything, and have minimal trade even within the bloc. That at its height, trade within the Soviet bloc was something on the order of 5 or 6% of their economies was from trade. Freedom of action was valued above comparative advantage. So sacrificing economic efficiency and rates of growth in order to be relatively less vulnerable to disruption from a hostile outside environment. The US decided to stand that on its head, to maximize growth for ourselves, for the newly developing countries, and the recovering both allies and adversaries of World War II, by implementing steps that would make it easier to capture comparative advantage. Countries with oil and natural gas would be able to develop and export them. Those with advanced machine tools capability would produce those. Those producing agricultural goods could concentrate on that and could trade them freely or relatively freely. And so that everybody would benefit from comparative advantage trade-offs. The trade-off for the United States in the policy of this was to surrender a degree of freedom of action. We accepted dependence on the Middle East for oil, for example, South Africa for tungsten and molybdenum, I think it was in there, that instead of seeking colonies where we would control the sources of the resources, we agreed to rely on the market, which was not very risky because we were the richest country in the world. Whatever the price, we could buy them, but was not so risky for us as was perceived to be risky from others. acceptance of the constraints of international institutions. In international relations theory, big countries, major powers don't like any kind of constraints in the international system. The analogy is Gulliver and the Lilliputians. Gulliver doesn't volunteer to let the little guys tie him down with their threads, but there are so many little guys that can be constraining. That's the analogy that was and is used. The US agreed to accept constraints on freedom of action most of the time. We had the advantage, clear advantage, that if or when we decided that abiding by the institutions and the rules that we had helped build was inconvenient, like the war with Iraq, we ignored them. And we made up a reason that justified it to ourselves, if not always to others. So the basic approach was to build a series of interdependent relationships that were designed to foster growth and prosperity, and to use this prosperity in all of the participating countries to reduce the dangers of populism and fascism. That the origins of the Great Depression, not by coincidence, coincide with the rise of fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, right-wing extremism in the United States, as well as in other parts where it didn't triumph, but it became strong. So linking that to growth, giving ordinary people a stake in the system. The overall objective: reduce the intensity of conflict, of economic conflict, of competition for resources, optimize opportunities for advancement of others, and thereby reduce the danger of military conflict, which had taken on an entirely different character after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we entered the nuclear age, that there could be no longer such a thing as a quaint little war, a little war for resources or something that if it was over a serious issue, the danger of going nuclear was simply too great. So that big set of objectives, and there were more than I can do in the summary, provided the background for the trading system and the tariff regime that has been upended by our current administration. And let me shift briefly to the article in the Great Decisions Workbook for those who have read it or may read it, by Michael Mastinduno, an economist at Dartmouth. It begins with many ways predictable economist outrage at what the Trump administration has done, and enumerates several of those things. He particularly harps on the administration's mischaracterization and distortion of the system that was in place, what I just summarized, and ignoring the non-trade specific goals and benefits of that system. He does acknowledge, as I did last week and will reiterate today, the system was broken. That for those of you who participated in the Great Decisions program last year, there was a session on tariffs, and Michael Beeman spoke to us on his new at the time book called Walking Out. And it's basically the 30-year history of the US walking back from the post-World War II trade regime that we had built and maintained. The point being here is that things that were a great idea in 1950, after the demise of the Soviet Union, the recovery of Europe and Japan, the rise of the Asian tigers, specifically or particularly China, things that were put in place for a very different world no longer suited the system or the needs of the system. So it needed to be fixed. And I'll come back in a minute to why that was getting it fixed was a problem. That Mr. Trump and this administration, in Mastrandano's words, which I don't disagree with, but they're his words, that Trump is determined to replace the liberal international order with an illiberal one, based on the weaponization of U.S. market power. That's right, but it distorts, in a sense, the earlier system that I described favorably also aimed to weaponize U.S. economic power and market power, but in a very different way. Use that as an instrument to help other development in the idea that it wasn't zero sum. They did better, we do better. They got richer, they could buy more stuff from us, that would make us richer. So it was using trade, export controls, tariffs to achieve a different set of objectives. That when Mr. Trump announced Liberation Day in April, which is the announcement of tariffs that the Supreme Court disallowed on Friday, because he predicated that on a 1970s law for international economic emergencies that does not give the president tariff authority. So he made up a rationale to do it. But when he announced it, that was to free the United States from a burdensome global trading system that the U.S. had maintained since World War II. We would no longer be, quote, looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by other nations. I think that's a pretty wild distortion of reality. And like many other statements that have come out of this administration, it's distorted or simply not true. Most people wouldn't know that it's not true. Most people don't pay attention. And if our system is working well, most people shouldn't pay attention. If it's working, let the professionals, let the politicians, but it stopped working really well in the 1980s. We can see that clearly looking backward. I couldn't see it quite so clearly in the 1980s and into the 1990s, but it's where the gap between the bottom and the top, between the middle class and the ultra rich, really began to widen. And the benefits of the system that had been broadly distributed and broadly experienced began not to be so obvious. So the United States continued to get richer and richer. Contrary to the characterization by Mr. Trump, U.S. per capita economic production from 1950 to today continues to be faster than any place in the world. Faster than the world average, faster than the European Union, faster than Japan, much faster than China, the model that's held up. But individual American households for the last 35 years have not experienced that kind of improvement. The wealth became much more unevenly distributed, creating a political problem that was not addressed properly in this country. Mastrandano describes what he calls a bizarre formula used by the administration to calculate the amount of exploitation by other nations that looks at trade deficit numbers. Trade deficit is an artifact of things we count for other reasons. It's not a completely meaningless number, but it's a very misleading number. Among other things, what determines the amount of deficit is where is the made in sticker put on a product. So whoever puts it in the box gets 100% of the credit or blame for the, so Nike shoes coming in from China or Korea or Vietnam, 100% of that imported cost is attributed to whoever put them in a box. That typically is about 8 or 9% of the costs. Most of the rest of that is in the United States. The design, design of the manufacturing equipment, the transport, the insurance, the shipping, the wholesaling, and the retailing, all of that money is in whatever country is receiving. So that part makes it silly. There's also the president's fixation on trade imbalances and wanting to reduce them to zero. And some of these, the thinking is just bizarre. That it has suggested that Canada should be buying as much from the United States as we buy from Canada. I think we have 37 times as many people in the United States as Canada. They couldn't possibly buy as much from us as they sell to us. And to apply this to someplace like Switzerland, it does meet the Mastantuono notion of bizarre. But there are some not completely crazy goals for the administration's policy, what it's trying to do, using tariffs to raise revenue. And since April, when these crazy mishmash of sometimes on, sometimes off, sometimes raised, sometimes reduced, sometimes exempted, that nobody can keep track of, was intended to generate revenue, and it has generated about $180 billion. That's $1 billion a day. That's not chicken feed. And again, by public statements, the administration has spent this money many times to do many different things, but at least a portion of it is to appease Democrat and Republican budget hawks who look at the size of the federal deficit and how that is ballooning because of the big beautiful bill or the big ugly bill, depending on your preferred characterization. Tariffs are intended to close a portion of the gap because income taxes have been reduced very inequitably. They're reduced for the very rich. They're reduced for everybody, but mostly for the very rich and for big corporations. And by lots of different groups' calculations, the amount that American households, average households, pay for the increased tariff bill exceeds the amount of their tax reduction under the tax reduction bill. So good news, my income tax went down. Bad news, I got to pay twice as much in total. And tariffs are a tax. They're a tax on consumers. The president's statements about the exporting country paying them notwithstanding, they're paid by whoever signs for the shipment when it gets off the boat or comes through the pipeline from Canada. And it either is or isn't passed on to the consumers in form of higher prices, or if the company eats it, said we're going to preserve our market share by not raising costs to individuals. Shareholders pay that. That's you and me, mostly. Whether we own individual stocks or have retirement funds or insurance funds being invested. So that's the hidden tax that is there. It was also intended to cut the trade deficit. Besides the Supreme Court decision last week, we got official government data on trade in 2025. The trade deficit went up in 2025. It's greater, it's more than $1 trillion in goods. And that's higher than it was before the marvelous instrument of tariffs. It was also to return manufacturing to the United States. It was to lead to companies relocating back to the United States, foreign companies locating in the United States, building new factories. That data is in two. The number of new factories went down in 2025, and the number of existing factories closing in the United States increased. So other than generating revenue, it hasn't done the other things that it was supposed to do in terms of policy. With that as a framing concept, both historically and where we are today in terms of the efficacy of these policies, let me turn relatively briefly to the trade, tariff, and economic components of the U.S. economic policy that were in place, to some extent are still in place, but disrupted by the tariff. I'll look at some of the successes and surprises out of the application of these policies, and then the disruptions and what they imply and what consequences they will have. That in addition to the goals of precluding or reducing the danger of another global depression and of facilitating and accelerating development in all countries and building interdependencies that for self-interest reasons, countries would decide cooperation was better than conflict. A goal of the policies was to end U.S. isolationism. That before World War I, U.S. isolationism, we wanted no part. This is Europe's war. This is a war over empire. Before World War II, very strong isolationist movement in the United States. That's why it took Roosevelt so long to build support. And without Pearl Harbor, it's questionable whether the U.S. would have actually intervened in the war. So it was designed to build interest and stakes in a smooth running international order, evolving lots and lots of constituencies in the United States. Geographic constituencies, state by state, firm by firm, academic institutes, and to build mechanisms that would enable the United States or American actors to influence and mitigate decisions and developments in the international order. That you can't have influence if you're sitting on the sideline. That was the basic premise of it, that we would directly and indirectly use our experience or expertise to shape the world in a way that was consistent with the interdependency goals that we sought. It's not surprising in many respects that this system, this approach, was developed by the advisors to Franklin Roosevelt, almost all of whom were Wall Street bankers. At the time, they were the most internationalist group in the United States. They were the ones that were engaged in international business, that were financing international transactions. They had a better understanding than anybody else, and they had a stake. So they built a system that benefited them. But it was also, it didn't only benefit them, it had a larger objective and rationale. The system was designed, intended to avoid mistakes of the Versailles peace process after World War I. One of which was the imposition of harsh reparations on Germany and the other losing countries that triggered depression, that triggered fascism in it, and produced debts that could not be repaid, and stifled development in what had been important economies. That it was also designed to avoid the American mistake coming out of World War I of walking away from Wilson's League of Nations. Again, this took the Americans off the field. You can't have influence if you're not in a room. You can't influence developments if you won't play. But we decided, and this system was designed to engage us and enmesh us, and some would say ensnare and entrap us in the managing of problems before they got out of hand. It evolved over decades to much of the rest of the world waiting for the Americans to have some proposal because they became confident that if we had a proposal, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, if we proposed it, we'd probably pay for it. If we pay for it, it might be a little better than going without it. So the expectations of what the United States would do that is criticized by Mr. Trump as exploitation, but it also came understandably to be perceived by ordinary American people. Said, why are we doing this? The rationale became unclear. The approach was untested. In theory, it was a better idea, but it was untested. And the original intention was that it was to be universal. All countries would be a part of this, including the free trade system. All countries at the time was 57. A third of what we've got now, basically. But very quickly, that became impossible because of the Cold War. I remind you of the Stalin multiple autarky model. All of the socialist camp was not allowed to participate in this system, except in the United Nations, in those organizations. So it still seemed like a good idea, and it seemed like a better idea than the alternative, and it became the economic model for what became known as the free world. Reducing tariffs, building interdependencies became the warp and the woof of the free world. The system that, quote, won the Cold War became a positive model of development. This is relevant because after the Soviet Union went out of business in December of 1991, the alternative model had clearly failed. The give or take 3/4 of the newly independent countries had adopted that model because they didn't want to be constrained by the former colonial masters. A lot of that was the British Empire. They didn't want to be snared. The rest was the French or the Spanish, the Portuguese Empire. So anything but what the mother country had involved, it had a certain appeal to the new countries until it collapsed. They had a positive example, not just in the now highly developed free world, in China. China, after 1978, walked away from this Stalinist model, adopted a variant of market capitalism, and did very well. So there was we can do this too. We want into the system. I said a while ago that there were a number of obstacles to reforming the system. One was the come into the game lately nations that wanted to do what China did. They didn't want to be like China. They didn't want that political system, but they wanted export growth model. They wanted preferred access to the United States and other developed country markets. They wanted to be able to take advantage of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and other facilitate development institutions that were created. And they acted, and almost in these words said, don't change the system. We've just figured it out. We want in. Don't start tinkering with this thing until we get on a better economic footing. That's why it was the big developing countries that posed the greatest obstacle to moving forward with the Doha and other rounds that were intended to fix problems in the trading system. The new system, the US system, was dollar-based. It was the only reasonably stable currency at the time. So it was less let's use this as an instrument of leverage and control than the only alternative was gold. And that wasn't a particularly attractive one. But over the decades, it gave the United States real advantages. Every other country has to hedge against currency oscillation, up and down. You got the when I used to pay attention to this at Stanford, Janet undoubtedly did more. The amount of money that Stanford had to set aside in case the cost of its overseas operations changed because of dollar fluctuation rates. Other countries have to do that because more than half of all of the invoices signed in the world are signed in US dollars. And almost 90% of all banking transactions in the world are in dollars. And they all go through New York City. Does that give us visibility into the global economic situation? It certainly does. So this is viewed, not unreasonably, by a number of other countries as this is an unfair advantage for the Americans. I think that view is probably more correct than we are being exploited because the other world has large reserves, foreign exchange reserves, mostly denominated in dollars. That last time I checked, something like 2/3 of all the dollars that we have issued are in other countries. They're not here. If you're pick your country, anywhere around the world, and you want a safe reserve, whether you're a national bank or a firm or an individual putting money under the mattress, dollars are not bad. There are more $100 bills outside of the United States than anywhere ever used inside the United States. So we use tariffs, low tariffs of our own, and allowing higher tariffs on the part of others to stimulate development, to stimulate trade, to build interdependencies. And the short answer is it worked. It worked. But it needed to be fixed because there are many, many things. Bretton Woods that set up the banking arrangement, and Adrian worked for the World Bank. This was set up to manage monetary and financial problems that became apparent in the interwar period, got fixed, but they don't even remotely touch most of the financial transactions that take place every day now. The movement of money by hedge funds in stock markets, that it just exceeds, and there's no rules, or there's no international regime to manage this. We sort of manage it because we're so big, but it's hardly a perfect arrangement. We need to bring lots of other people into it, which requires leadership to do it. And we have abdicated our right to leadership in this and many other, in my view. So we set out with institutions, drafting the rules often. Initially, we drafted. Over time, more and more, this became collective, that as Europe recovered, as the Japanese economy recovered, and then as others were added to this, is the international system was no longer a wholly owned American subsidiary. It belongs to everybody. And the ethos of democracy, everybody affected thinks they ought to have a voice in shaping it, and that's perfectly reasonable. Totally impractical, because then you get the General Assembly of the United Nations where 193 countries cannot agree what day of the week it is. So who leads? And the default for a long time was the United States. We're not the default anymore, mostly because we retreated from it, but then because we abused it when we have been abusing it. We use this to strengthen alliances. We use it to reduce the danger of conflict. We use it to create business opportunities. Now, mostly we created conditions that allowed the private sector around the world to do its thing, to pursue economic advantage. It worked. Wars were largely avoided, wars between major powers. Nuclear war was avoided. An unprecedented degree of stability made it possible for globalization to occur. You have to get rid of pirates to have safe shipping of commodities over any distance. It's still today, 85% of all the goods in the world move on the ships because it's so much cheaper to do it. So managing customs duties at ports, customs duties for a long time, that was the primary means of generating revenue for governments. And then people discovered income tax, and as people had things to tax and land tax and all. But facilitating customs transactions, you don't have to inspect every container. You can't possibly inspect every container. Elements of reliability, trust that are built into this thing to make it work in there. Now we have reversed here. It says, we can't take a chance that there's fentanyl in any one of those 100,000 containers coming in. We got to inspect them all. You say, that's nuts. You can't do that. It stops everything. Trust within the system is just critical. As Europe, Japan, Korea later rebuilt, prospered, became integrated European Union, NATO, the bilateral alliance relationships with the United States. In Asia, they're all hub and spokes. Other country allied with Washington because animosity to Japan precluded anything like NATO in Asia and does to this day in there. So they're different systems. But it wasn't trade contributed to the relationships and the trust and the interdependence that made the alliances viable. We became extraordinarily wealthy. Many others did as well. But the system was waning in its utility, its relevance to the problems of today. And the US under several administrations, going back to George H.W. Bush, that made attempts to tinker with it but nobody had a really clear idea about what it ought to be. The first one, George H.W. Bush, was let's turn the Cold War bipolar animosity into bipolar cooperation. Moscow and Washington together would bring about, started with the Middle East. Middle East didn't work. And Clinton attempted to revitalize the UN system, international peacekeeping operations, more in the Clinton administration than the whole rest of the history of the United Nations. It didn't work. It didn't work. And there have been others. Obama got distracted. George W. Bush got distracted by, in Obama's case, the global financial crisis. In Bush, it's the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Simply couldn't do it, and it kept deteriorating. These problems were not solving themselves, so they got worse. And the American political support for them eroded more and more. And the disparities that the system was designed to mitigate, that led to populism and dangers of authoritarianisms, actually played out in the United States, or playing out in a number of other countries as well. So the tariff regime is broken. The Trump focus on trying to do something about it. Again, it's not wrong, it's not crazy, it's overdue. Unfortunately, he's come at it with either woeful ignorance of the rationale for what was there before and how it operated, or willful disregard of what made it work, and disdain for the mechanisms that were designed to minimize corruption in the system. He didn't break it, but he made the break worse. And the fixes of which Mr. Tariff Man proclaimed as the centerpiece of fixing it are clearly the wrong solution to the set of problems. And as what's happened so far, data that I summarized at the beginning: fewer factories closing, increased goods deficit for the United States, and trade deficit in goods, and so forth. They're not working on it. But what has been disrupted is not simply trading arrangements, production lines, supply lines, which have become multinational. Until the 1980s, almost none of them were. All production supply line had to be pretty much local, because you had to have an engineer that could walk into the factory next door and adjust the machine on it. Now, with computers, you can do it long distance. The 5,000-mile fine adjustment screwdriver that can make changes in minutes. And if costs of utilities or insurance or land or whatever it is changes, companies can move, and they do move in pursuit of their own economic advantages and in honoring responsibility to shareholders. So we have disrupted things without putting in place a viable replacement. Good news in this is that, at least in the United States, most of the economy is in the private sector. Companies do what they do. They exist to maximize profits and return. Depending on the day of the week, they do things to make the political leadership happy. But that's not who they're accountable to. So a lot of this stuff is having less disruptive effects than it might have. There's a resilience in the system. But that's not good enough. We need more than resilience. We need positive measures to reform, to transform, to expand the opportunities and advantages for lots of people. That the problems are real, and we need better ways to address them. But approaching it as what Trump's doing is wrong. What are you in favor of? I'm in favor of not doing what Trump is doing. That's not an answer. Not doing anything, going back to what, that's also not an answer. It was broken. Going back to what wasn't working very well is not a viable option. How we're going to do this, what mix of government expertise, corporate finance world expertise, lessons learned from others. The one thing I'm reasonably confident of, there's no on the sidelines alternative to American leadership. That the idea that somebody, China, Germany, Japan, the EU as a unit, is going to step into a vacuum created by the American retreat, I think is farcical. It's not going to happen. The unwillingness, unpreparedness to step up and do this, in theory, we could orchestrate some type of a collective group to reorder the world, but we have no experience in doing that. You know, point I think I made last time, in the 1940s when we did this, we didn't have to check with anybody. We did. We'd check with London usually. So we want to do this. Okay. You'll pay for it, go right ahead. That was it, right? That's an impossible arrangement now, and also undesirable. But we've got a dilemma, and I'll end with this, that the disruption to the international system has been made much greater. The squandering of confidence and trust in the United States and U.S. leadership, the antagonizing of the American public towards things outside our borders makes it harder for any American to kind of step up and take the lead. So we're in I think, a period of difficulty, hopefully not depression, but the resilience demonstrated by our economy, to some extent the global economy, to a large extent the global economy, is heartening. It could have been a lot worse. It could be a lot worse. But what's clearly happening is the rest of the world is finding ways to work around the United States. And if I was a government official in most other countries, I'd advise doing exactly this, what they're doing. That it doesn't make sense to tie your fate to the unpredictability of what we have become. But it's not long-term viable. Figuring out how to characterize the world. It's not great power rivalry. It's not we were exploited for so long, we got to turn inward. And one simple, pay attention to the numbers, and I'll end this, that the MAGA rhetoric and much of the sort of logic in the Trump approach is U.S. go it alone, U.S. self-reliance on this, a Stalinist approach, a fascist approach, Mussolini or Hitler approach to do it.
That's how I got it back.
And end of the day, we are 4.5% of the world's population. That means 95.5% are not inside the United States. If you're thinking about economic growth and interdependence and stabilizing, why would you concentrate on 4.5% to ignore and antagonize 95%. It makes no sense. And I've hit my goal of stopping in an hour. So I will now open it up to questions. I hope that in what I've thrown at you is reasonably clear. I'll start in the room. Please wait for the microphone, and then we'll pick up the Zoom questions.
How do you introduce climate change into this whole mix?
How do we introduce climate change into this whole mix? That climate change is a multifaceted problem or challenge, right? That on nutrition, on quality of life, but also on economic performance. Coping with the effects of climate change is going to be very expensive. That Biden's idea, leaving aside how good or fully developed the idea was, that you pursued economic growth and prosperity by doing things that also had a chance of mitigating climate effects. So far, we have paid much too much rhetorical attention, my view, to combating the spread of greenhouse gases, shifting from petrochemicals to sustainable, all of which is important. But I used to work on climate change stuff. And to my knowledge, the numbers haven't changed from the scientific community. That if we did things today to reduce greenhouse gases, say, or the other causative effects, we're not going to see the effects for 25 years. The consequences of previous warming are here now. Sea level rise. Sea level rise is a here and now problem. It's only a matter of years till the San Francisco airport goes underwater, let alone Miami, Shanghai, much of Southeast Asia. And that, again, simple population distribution around the world, most people everywhere in the world live within 100 miles of the water. That's what's going to flood. That's where the floodplains are going to rise. Sea level rise is bringing salt intrusion into breeding grounds for sea life, affecting agriculture. So my bottom line is we have to stop juxtaposing this. Climate change or economic, no, they got to be two sides of the same coin. We are smart enough to walk and chew gum at the same time. And in 2008, I gave testimony in the Congress. That's still the only testimony on geopolitical effects of climate change given by a sitting U.S. official. We did it, Senator Feinstein made me do it. She wrote it into legislation that we do this, but we did it in order to lay out the problem for U.S. decision makers. He said, this stuff at the time we did it, this is 20 years from now. You've got a window you can do something, but it's a closing with nothing's happened. Nothing's happened on it. So it's going to be harder. And it's got to be done in conjunction with tackling all these other problems. Peter?
Yeah. I just wanted to get back to when you spoke about the actions of the United Nations under the different presidents. You mentioned going to Iraq and how Clinton was the one that tried to get a coalition of nations to stop the Bosnian. I think we should applaud the history of President Clinton's use of his influence to get somebody put on trial in the International Court of Human Rights. And we have somebody locked up for that. That's what I really appreciate about the history.
Yeah.
Would you repeat the question or the comment, please?
The comment, Zoom people, was that we should applaud some of the things that President Clinton attempted to do in using the United Nations systems and other multilateral mechanisms to address problems. And I think that's right. Um, truth in packaging. I was a Clinton appointee, assistant secretary. But I think the efforts were well intended, were reasonably well thought through. But getting it right the first time is pretty hard. And instead of trying to learn lessons from what didn't work in that approach, we've walked away from it. Said, tried that and it failed. And a big piece of that is utilizing the United Nations system. For all of its problems, it does have the effect of many, many things we did over 80 years that Trump wants to do by, beating people on the head using American power. We say, no, this is the United Nations, decolonization being one of them, that do that without the United States beating up on our allies. So we are too selective in what we choose to learn and learn from. Let me take Lou, do you have any?
There are no questions online at this point, Tom.
Okay. Patty?
I kind of wanted your opinion on what you can guess. Why did the Supreme Court go ahead and let the tariffs go into effect when it was so obvious that it was so against the Constitution?
It's a guess, and it's an uninformed guess that they recognized that they lacked deep understanding of what was going on, so that they could write a judgment that wouldn't be challenged 6 ways to Sunday for what it had missed, and or that they really hoped that Congress would step up to its responsibilities and put this where it belonged constitutionally, which is in the Congress, rather than in the courts, because apart from the reactionary majority on the court, the conservative tenor of the court is the judicial branch should be a last resort, should be an adjudicator, shouldn't be making policy, and shouldn't be making law. I think that's a part of the starting point. So it's give Congress a chance, and they didn't do it, didn't step up to the responsibility. Adrian?
I have a question.
Wait, if you use the mic so the Zoom people will hear it.
Why did the president decide on tariffs and did not go the road of devaluation?
Yeah, the question is, why did Trump decide on tariffs and not devaluate
Exactly.
the dollar? I don't know. Again, I can guess that it had to do with the views of the finance people in his administration, that Bassett, the Secretary of the Treasury, I assume his own understanding of this is minimal. So who was able to persuade him to do something? If they link it to his own financial interests in that, devaluation hits him as well as makes the U.S. more competitive in overseas markets. So I don't know, but I don't think it is a sophisticated economic argument that says use devaluation. That one of the instruments coming out of Bretton Woods to stabilizing currency to avoid highly destructive competitive devaluations, which was part of what led up to the Great Depression. So we built a lot of things into the system to make that hard and unattractive. I'll guess that some of it also requires legislation. And, we're now a year into the administration. With the Supreme Court decision, the tariff man has to rely on other statutory authorities, all of which require have a sunset provision, which is 150 days, most of them, and then congressional reauthorization of them. And the question of when he had a majority in both houses of Congress, why didn't he propose something? And clearly the answer has to do with narcissism and egotism and unitary executive theory of government and other things that same reason. There's been no legislation proposed to handle immigration. None. So if it's that great a problem, you can't come up with something on it. I'm happy not to be a part of this administration, but how it works, how it makes decisions, is incredibly opaque, even to the people like me that pretend to look at it. Any other questions in here? Let's go here.
Yeah, what do you think Trump's fundamental policy objective is in foreign policy? I mean, is it stabilizing the Western Hemisphere, getting communist influence out of our domain? Is it really bringing industry back to this country? It seems like he only has one tool in his toolbox, and that's tariffs.
Yeah.
But it's not clear what he's trying to accomplish.
That the question is, what do I think Mr. Trump's fundamental foreign policy goal is? Which tariffs are the sole tool in the toolbox. I think it's a vague notion of America first, an America that has fewer commitments, obligations to other countries, that has fewer constraints from international organizations and our participation in a rules-based order, even though we're the most important player in it. Beyond that, choice of instrument A, B, C, D, and then how they would work together, I see no evidence of a plan or of an integrated policy. And part of the reality we've got, the attacks on the so-called deep state. I guess I am a member of the deep state, or I was for a long time in there. Expertise and experience. The necessary aspect of bureaucracy, which when a policy is set, it keeps it running and can identify when it's not working and maybe come up with solutions. And the disparagement and dismissal of the utility of that kind of expertise with whatever was on foreign policy in the great big 2025 book that came out of Heritage, it does not have anything that begins to approximate the coherence of the liberal international order model that I have tried to describe in the last two sessions. It's not a happy answer. That I wish there was something I could describe, whether I wanted to praise it or criticize it. I don't know what it is. And I don't think anybody knows what it is. Which means it's very hard for others to make calculations. The only thing that is safe to assume is unpredictability, which doesn't really encourage investment. It doesn't encourage emphasizing this type of research or that type of research or anything else. It's wait and see, leading to paralysis, and the problems all get worse. Diane?
You said at the beginning that you would take an opportunity during the Q&A session to explain the thinking of, or the decision that was handed down by this Supreme Court.
Yeah, I have, would I honor my commitment to say more about the Supreme Court decision? I'll try. That it's a 117-page decision, I think. That's the length of it, which isn't really unusual in terms of the length of it. But it seems to be, from what I've read, focused on the constitutional question. Who has the authority to impose tariffs? And that's pretty clearly the Congress, in the Constitution and in the body of judgments and laws that have been passed in 250 years. That, in that sense, it's narrow. It's not, you can't do tariffs. It's not, you can't use tariffs as the all-purpose instrument to compel other countries to follow your bidding. It's, you have to use the right legislation. And the package of legislation that so far has been identified, of 301, 322 and 202 of, these are parts of the federal code, all of which are linked to special purpose. Sometimes it's trade deficit, sometimes it's currency devaluation issues that are time-bound. They're intended to be a short-term, get people's attention, to try and get the problem work done, and to kick it back to Congress. So in that sense, a narrow decision, the default of which is this belongs in the Congress. There's a problem, from my perspective, with that. All tariff legislation, all trade legislation used to be done in the Congress. That was the locus for U.S. trade policy and tariffs. That changed in the last several decades because the number of commodities is so much greater. The complexity of markets. That I remember somebody plopped on my desk when I was assistant secretary, said, here's the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement. It was that high. It was 7 or 8 inches thick with thousands and thousands of product numbers in it. It was blue and it's made out of this kind of hardwood in that place. And it's in this size, very, very specific stuff. So for decades, Congress has de facto transferred responsibility for trade agreements to the executive branch, which has the staff, has the expertise. You know, a committee that's responsible for trade in the Congress maybe has 10 permanent staff members, and members of that committee, maybe half of them have one of their staff that specializes in that as opposed to arms control or agriculture or something else. So the complexity of the task effectively moved it to the executive branch. And I'm trying to remember the name of the authority that gives the president authority to negotiate the trade agreement. When it comes back to the Congress for approval, all they can do is vote up or down. They can't tamper with it. because every one of those thousands of things is a trade-off in there. We'll let you import shrimp of a certain size in this time of year, but in exchange, we want to be able to sell tennis rackets and skis. And that I made that up, but there are literally thousands of such trade-offs. And the locus of lobbying activity and the channeling of campaign finances to influence is now almost entirely in the executive branch. So what the court has done in saying, Congress, you have to step up to this, that until something major changes, they don't have the capacity to do much on it. Even if they had backbone and weren't spending most of the time raising money and stuff. It's a manifestation of how globalization, international trade have transformed institutions, and the failure of institutions to change with them is a problem. Diane?
You say,
Wait.
when you say it's put into the executive branch, then you're indicating that there were certain committees or certain special loci that did that. It wasn't the president necessarily.
Correct. That we have the U.S. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and parts of the Commerce Department. Commerce Department did it, got too complicated, too big. U.S. Trade Representative as the special can't do it alone, so the Pentagon is involved, the State Department is involved, Treasury is involved, because you got to finance all of these things. And getting the critical mass of expertise, working across different committees with different responsibilities in the Congress, the best of intentions, a small group of bright people is just not going to be up to the task. Executive branch stuff, where having been a member for 25 years, the need to coordinate everybody hates that idea, but it's absolutely essential because you have to be on basically the same page or singing from the same sheet of music, so that what you do in the Commerce Department doesn't conflict with what you're trying to do out of the Treasury Department. Your commitments you've made to the World Bank or the IMF, or bilateral agreements on this, all of this stuff that has to be deconflicted and harmonized and requires deep expertise to begin to understand this. And that's even before you get to the tax code, which is written with reference to these agreements. And that's a whole different set of interests in there. So that I am a little bit sympathetic to the Trump approach of blow it all up and start again. It's also Mao's approach. But the cost of getting from blowing it all up to having a replacement and the potential damage and disruption makes me very reluctant to say we ought to take that risk. That we need a lot of Band-Aids and baling wire here. Lou, do you have anything?
Nothing here.
We've got more here.
Okay, go ahead, please.
President Trump often uses national emergency, national security as justification for a number of things that he does. And I wondered if you could comment with regard to tariffs and economic policy, if he just says, well, for national security, we have to do, I have to do this. How far do you think he can take that argument when it comes to economic policy?
But he's taken it, President Trump uses reference to national security often to justify policy. It says we're in a national security emergency. He's got a long line of predecessors who have used this ploy, that in part because as politics has become more partisan, as special interest politics has become more the norm in our country, that getting consensus, getting trade-offs, getting agreement on addressing problems is harder and harder. So for 3 decades anyway, we have used, all administrations have used the ploy of putting contentious and costly and arguably necessary measures into the national security bucket. It's one reason our Defense Department is $1 trillion a year, and we don't have any enemies. But a lot of that $1 trillion budget arguably has very little to do with defense and national security. We use it as a way to redistribute funds from the rich states to the poor states. Every single congressional district, every county has some type of a military facility. People who staff it have children. They go to schools. So we impose a burden on the local school system, so we subsidize it. They have houses that need to be protected by fire departments, so we subsidize local government for the fire department. We keep roads in good shape because we might have to move military equipment. That kind of rationale. I don't have a particular problem with California paying for poorer states in Massachusetts. So we transfer a lot of money, a lot more money to Washington than we get back. But rather than slug it out to get priorities and plans for rational phased development, we hide it by saying this is necessary for national security. The latest in the Biden administration was industrial policy, the CHIPS and Science Act, which probably should be called white collar welfare for Silicon Valley. The billions of dollars channeled into imitating the Chinese model of picking national champion companies and undertakings. We can't rely simply on market competition and entrepreneurial activity, because production of advanced electronics is so critical to our weapon system, to our deterrence, to our national security. So it's Mr. Trump, in this one, he's got lots of company in doing it. I understand the political reasons for doing it. I think it's terrible. I do political science because I think politics, I like a good political fight. That's where you hammer it out and you get compromise so that everybody gets some of what they want and you can come back at it another time. I hope that begins to answer. I'll take one more in here, and then we're about out of time.
Yeah. I assume then, regardless of what happens in the midterms, you don't expect any dramatic shift in any of this.
The question is, regardless of the midterm outcome, do I not expect anything dramatic? I think we can get, with a small number of seats changing from R to D, the capacity to run over the Congress disappears. That the capacity of Democrats to block stuff. And I think even the Trump administration, others in the administration for sure, that want to do things, that see a need to do things. Our country has a lot of problems, a lot of things we need to be tackling. Now we wait for the president to pronounce, or it just floats. I think there's going to be more capacity for consensus, in that sense, bipartisan efforts to tackle problems, tackle real problems that need attention. Climate change was raised earlier. That's certainly one of them. Education, immigration. It only takes a couple of congressional seats to take away the three branch domination that has existed and enabled Mr. Trump to do what he's doing. So it's stopping bad things is better than not stopping them. It may also be adequate to make it possible to do more good things, positive things. We've reached the end of the side. Lou, do you have anything from Zoom land or your closing comments?
No, why don't you let us know what's on tap for next week, and then we'll wrap up the Zoom.
Okay. Thanks to everybody for coming in person or online. Next week is U.S.-China. The article in Great Decisions book was written by a Stanford colleague, Oriana Maestro. The speaker is going to be Matthew Dolbo. Matthew is a career Foreign Service officer who has been at Stanford. He's now in the second year of a fellowship in the Freeman Spogli Institute. He has served on the National Security Council. He's got multiple tours in China and Japan, Korea. Most recently, he was U.S. Consul General on Okinawa. So he will give his take on U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China policy. And he has more recent experience in doing that than I do. So I'm delighted to have him with us next week. Okay. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for another very engaging conversation. We appreciate that very much. So to everybody on the Zoom, you are very welcome to come back again next week. Please make sure you have the registration information so that you can get on without any difficulty. And again, although we will begin admitting from the waiting room about 6:55. So anyway, with that, I am going to stop the recording. And after I do that, I'll stop the meeting. Thanks for everybody, either in person or on Zoom. Good night.
Well done for lowering the temperature on everything.
Thank you.